She did not hear the first shot. What she heard was a spoon in the enamel mug, tapping once again ceramic. As the ground beneath the barracks district gave a hard, unnatural shudder, the kind that did not belong to wind or heavy trucks or helicopters settling onto a pad. The coffee trembled. Steam lifted into the cold morning air. Then the siren tore open the sirens. Not a drill, not a test. A full-throated alarm, metallic and ugly, rolling across the forward operating base like an animal in pain. By the time the second concussion hit, glass had burst inward from the mess hall windows. Men were already shouting. Boots hammered plywood walkways. A fuel drum somewhere behind the motor pool went up with a wet orange bloom that pushed black smoke into the pale blue of dawn. And on the western ridge line, where the sun had not yet touched the rock, muzzle flashes winked like cruel little stars. She had come carrying a scarf and a care package. 3 minutes later, she was on her knees behind a concrete barrier with dust in her teeth, blood on the sleeve of her civilian coat, and a sniper rifle pressed against her shoulder, as if it had been waiting there for years. If that opening caught hold of you, stay with this story because it only grows sharper, stranger, and more human from here. On this channel, you get cinematic stories of courage, sacrifice, and impossible choices. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more narratives that feel as real as a heartbeat. Now listen closely because this did not begin with a rifle. It began with a woman trying very hard to be only a wife. Her name was Evelyn Hart, though almost nobody on the base called her that by the end of the day. To her husband, she was Eve. To the small circle of spouses back in Virginia Beach, she was the quiet one who always remembered birthdays and never stayed long after dinner. To the clerk who checked her paperwork at the airstrip 2 days earlier, she was Mrs. Chief Petty Officer Daniel Hart. Temporary visitor, authorized entry, no weapons, no classified access civilian, just another military wife stepping into the hard geometry of a life that existed between departures and returns. But names, like uniforms, only told part of story. She arrived at Kestrel Base just after sunrise under sky, so cold and clean it looked brittle. The transport aircraft had grown through the last hour of turbulence over the mountains, and everyone aboard came down pale and stiff, smelling faintly of recycled air, machine oil, and nerves. Kestrel sat in a narrow valley in the eastern highlands, a stitched-together fortress of HESCO barriers, corrugated shelters, radar arrays, communication towers, fuel bladders, and hard-packed roads the color of old bone. Beyond the wire, the world rose fast and mercilessly into stone. Nothing soft lasted long there. Not grass, not voices, not certainty. The wind had teeth. Evelyn paused at the foot of the transport ramp with one gloved hand on the strap of her duffel and looked out at the base spread below. Men and women moved with a clipped rhythm of routine under tension. Forklifts wind. Rotor washed from a distant helicopter dragged dust in long, low veils across the tarmac. Somewhere a generator throbbed with a steady mechanical base that seemed to live beneath everything else. The air smelled of diesel, frost, and burnt coffee. Mrs. Hart. She turned to find a young logistics specialist holding a clipboard against his chest. He was all elbows and earnestness. Not much older than 20. Freckles stark against wind-burned skin. Yes. Welcome to Kestrel, ma'am. I'm supposed to bring you to billeting, then over to admin for your visitor tag. Your husband's on rotation until 1300. He said he'd meet you after. She nodded. Thank you. He took her duffel before she could object and immediately regretted underestimating its weight. She noticed a slight hitch in his shoulder and almost smiled. Careful, she said. Books. He blinked. Books, ma'am. For Daniel. The specialist gave a small, baffled laugh, as if the idea of someone asking for books in a place like that were more surprising than the mountains. Yes, ma'am. They crossed the base on foot. As they walked, Evelyn took in details without seeming to. A guard tower on the northern wall had a fresh patch of welded steel at knee height. The sandbags along one fighting position were sun-faded and split at the corners. The western sensor mast leaned 1 degree off true. A mechanic in greased dark coveralls wiped his hands on a rag, stared at a convoy vehicle's undercarriage, then shook his head once before reaching for a different wrench. Near the communications building, a stack of wooden ammo crates had been left too close to a drainage trench that had frozen solid overnight. Small things, ordinary things, but she noticed them the way some people notice songs. Her escort talked to fill the silence. He pointed out the aid station, the chow hall, the chapel container painted in hopeful white, the gym pieced together from shipping units, the bunkhouse assigned to transient personnel. Evelyn listened politely, asked a question here and there, gave the kind of answers that encouraged no curiosity. Had she ever visited a deployed base before? Once or twice. Was it always this cold? Sometimes worse. Was her husband one of the special operations guys? He was her husband. That answer ended the conversation so neatly that the specialist almost laughed again. Billing assigned her a narrow room with a cot, a wool blanket, a dented locker, and a metal desk bolted to the floor. There was a single photograph pinned by someone else to the corkboard above the desk. A little girl in a pink coat holding up a fish bigger than her arm. The face was bright with triumph. No name, no note. A relic forgotten by whoever had slept there last. Evelyn stood looking at it for a long moment, then set her hand lightly on the desk as if steadying herself against an unseen motion. Travel always made her feel as though part of her arrived later than the body. She unpacked slowly. Sweaters, thermal socks, 2 paperback novels, a tin of cinnamon biscuits cushioned in cloth so they would not crumble. A small sealed packet of ground coffee from a roaster in Norfolk that Daniel liked because it smelled, he said, like mornings before the Navy had taught him what exhaustion was. And beneath it all, tucked in the bottom of the bag where no one would look unless they had reason, a weathered leather notebook bound with an elastic strap. She took it out, held it, did not open it. As she placed it in the locker and shut the door. At 12:47, Daniel Hart came through the building door with a cold on him. He was taller than most men, not because of height alone, but because fatigue never quite managed to bend him. Sand-colored combat uniform, plate carrier half unbuckled, gloves shoved through a shoulder strap, a fresh scrape along the angle of his jaw. The beard he grew on deployment had come in darker than it looked at home, making his smile seem almost younger when it broke over his face. And it did break fully, suddenly like sunrise reaching a ridge. He crossed the room in 3 strides and gathered Evelyn into him so tightly the air left her lungs. She pressed her face into the fabric at his chest and breathed in cold air, detergent, dust, and the unmistakable iron salt scent of a body that had lived in side armor for too many hours. For a second, she did not move at all. Then her hands found his back and held on. "You made it," he murmured into her hair. "I said I would. You hate flying." "I still do." He leaned back enough to look at her. "You look tired. You look terrible. That means you missed me." She touched the scrape on his jaw with the side of one finger. "That means you were careless. I was near someone else being careless. Very different." The laugh she gave him was soft, unwilling, and precious because it was real. Daniel watched it leave her face almost as soon as arrived. He had learned over the years that joy for Evelyn was not absent. It was guarded as if some inner century still demanded identification before letting light inside. He kissed her forehead. "Come on. I stole 15 minutes from the chain of command and at least 10 from common sense. Let me show you the palace." The palace was a loop around the less damaged parts of Kestrel. He walked her past the rec tent where 2 Marines argued over a hockey game frozen on a laptop screen, past the maintenance line, where an engine block lay open like a dissected beast, past defense communications, yard humming with power. The base was ugly in the way functional things often were, yet alive with the fierce domesticity of people determined to build routine wherever they were sent. Someone had painted a ridiculous palm tree on the side of a blast wall. A medic had placed 3 potted herbs outside the aid station door in empty ammunition cans. Near the operations building, a hand-lettered sign announced movie night if the generator behaved. Life improvising itself against violence. Daniel introduced her to men who looked at her first as a guest, and then more carefully when they realized she was his wife. Daniel was respected there. One could tell by the way other people shifted to make space around him without seeming to. The way information came to him before he asked for it. the way jokes sharpened and straightened in his presence without losing warmth. There was Lieutenant Nora, the intelligence officer, compact and fast-eyed with a voice like cool steel and a coffee addiction. She wore as openly as rank. There was Chief Ramirez from communications, broad-shouldered and prematurely gray, who spoke with a desert dryness that made everything sound like a verdict. There was Corporal Owen Pike, the youngest man on Daniel's team, all restless energy and hero worship he tried to hide beneath sarcasm. And there was Sergeant Miles Mercer, base security coordinator, who noticed Evelyn's gaze pause briefly on the western ridgeline and filed it away before offering her a polite nod. "You're seeing the high ground," he said. Evelyn looked back at him. "Hard not to. It bothers everybody the first day. It doesn't stop bothering you after that," she replied. Mercer studied her for half a second too long. "No, ma'am, it doesn't." Daniel changed the subject too quickly. Evelyn caught that, too. They ate a late lunch in a mess. The food was better than expected and hotter than most of the men had time to appreciate. Steam fogged the windows, trays clattered. Someone had coaxed a radio into life near the serving line. In an old country, song drifted in and out beneath the scrape of chairs. Evelyn sat across from Daniel with a paper cup of soup warming her hands while he demolished 2 plates of food like a man whose relationship with time had become permanently adversarial. "You still do that?" she said. "Do what?" "Eat like someone's going to take it." He finished chewing. "That is because someone usually is." "Daniel Eve." She lowered her voice. "Your last 2 emails were strange." He shrugged in a way that was not a shrug. "Base has been busy. You said the patrols were extending farther west. Intel ledgers, route adjustments, routine pressure." You said routine 3 times in one paragraph. That earned a brief flicker from Nora, who sat 2 tables away reviewing printed imagery with a pen tucked behind one ear. Daniel noticed her noticing and leaned back. "It's under control." That sentence in their marriage had never meant what it was supposed to. Evelyn broke off a piece of bread she did not want. "You have that look." "What look?" "The one where you've already made peace with something you haven't told me." The sounds of the mess hall moved around them. Steam hissed from the kitchen line. A chair dragged. Someone laughed too loudly at a joke that landed flat. Daniel glanced toward the frosted window, where the mountains beyond were only pale suggestions. "We've been getting probes," he said finally. "Not direct attacks. Range testing movement in villages that should be empty this time of year. Spotters maybe. Smugglers maybe. Maybe something more organized. Intel's still sorting signal from noise." "Are you sleeping?" He smiled without humor. "That's a very married question." "Daniel, a few hours." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his face softened. "No, not enough." She said nothing. She did not need to. The silence between them had long ago developed its own vocabulary. After lunch, Daniel was called away. Of course he was. A runner arrived with a tablet and urgency in his breath, and duty reclaimed him so fast it almost seemed physical. He touched Evelyn's shoulder before he left, fingers warm, even through the layers of her coat. "I'll see you tonight. If things free up, we'll watch the sunset from the South Tower." "You said that in your last deployment." "And did I mean it then, too?" "Yes." "Then maybe this time luck will finally get tired of disappointing me." He went before she could answer. Evelyn spent the afternoon, as military spouses often did, in places built for war rather than visitors, making temporary peace with uncertainty. She walked where she was allowed, read half a page of a novel without absorbing it, wrote 2 lines in a notebook and tore them out, drank coffee that tasted of metal and overboiled water. Try not to listen for the difference between normal bass noise and the kind that made everyone's shoulders change shape. By 15:30, clouds had gathered over the western ridge, laying long blue shadows into the valley. The temperature dropped fast. Soldiers moved with greater purpose. A convoy that had been scheduled to depart was delayed without public explanation. Mercer doubled a watch position near the fuel point. Nora spent 20 straight minutes on a secure radio and came out of the comms, building with a face that belonged to someone adding numbers she did not like. Evelyn saw all of it without seeming to. At 16:10, she stood near the perimeter chapel smoking area, though she herself had not smoked in 8 years, while two contractors complained about frozen pipes. Beyond them, between stacked barriers, she had a partial view of the western approach road. Something about the stillness out there was wrong, not empty, tuned, as if the landscape were holding its breath. A memory brushed the back of her mind before she could stop it. Wind over shale, cold in the trigger finger. The ache behind the eye after hours behind glass. Waiting not for movement, but for the shape of intention. She turned away from the road so sharply that one of the contractors noticed. "You all right, ma'am?" "Yes." She folded her arms tighter, just colder than I expected. He grinned. "Base says that about everybody." At dusk, Daniel found her again. True to his word. For 17 stolen minutes, they stood on the south tower wrapped in the kind of cold that made every breath visible, looking out over a valley gone blue and silver in the failing light. Below them, the base glowed in islands. Sodium lamps lit windows. The amber beads of vehicles tracing cautious lines between buildings. Farther out, the mountains rose like sleeping giants with knives under their skin. The sunset was not red. It was harder than that. A band of burning copper behind black ridges. Then a thin wash of violet. Then the first clean pin pricks of evening. Daniel stood beside her with gloved hands on the rail. "I used to hate this view." "Used to. Now I hate what it means when I can't see it." She looked sideways at him. "That sounds like something you rehearsed." It sounded smarter in my head. She smiled faintly. Below, a guard called a watch change. Metal clanged somewhere near the motor pool. The wind carried the smell of aviation fuel and snow. Daniel took a breath. "I'm glad you came." "You're surprised." "A little." "I was too." He turned. "Then why come now?" She kept her eyes on the horizon long enough that he almost regretted asking. "Because the last 6 months felt like being married through a closed door." She said at last. "Because you were riding around things instead of about them. Because every time the phone rang after midnight, I thought." She stopped. He waited. She let the rest of the sentence die in the air between them. He knew what it was anyway. So who did she? "I thought they had come to tell me you would not be coming home." Daniel's jaw shifted once. He looked back toward the mountains. "I'm sorry. That's not the same as changing it." No, a pause. "It isn't." For a while they said nothing. That too was marriage. Not the absence of speech, but the trust to endure its weight together. Then Daniel asked too casually, "Did you bring the notebook?" The question moved through her like a hidden blade. "What notebook?" "The leather one." She did not answer immediately. The wind rattled the antenna above them. Somewhere below, laughter burst and vanished. Finally, she said, "Why would you ask me that here?" "Because you looked at the ridge, the way people look at old graves." She closed her eyes once. "Open them." "That is not an answer." "No," he swallowed. "But it's the reason." Evelyn faced him fully then, and in the fading light, the old pain between them showed itself, not as anger, but as accumulated weather. Years of speaking around a ruined city, neither wanted to map aloud. "That part of my life is over." Daniel did not push. Perhaps because he had learned the cost of pushing. Perhaps because he understood that saying a thing was over did not always mean it was dead. Sometimes it meant it was buried shallow. He touched the rail. "Mercer saw you clock the Western high ground." "I'm a guest on a base built in a bowl." "Any civilian with eyes would clock the Western high ground." "You are not any civilian." The words landed softly and with enough force to alter the temperature of the moment. Evelyn's voice thinned. "I married you to stop being what I used to be." "No," Daniel said gently. "You married me because we loved each other. Everything else came later." Below them, a generator coughed, caught, steadied. She turned back toward the valley. "I'm tired." He heard the boundary and honored it. "Then I'll walk you back." As they descended the tower stairs, Mercer climbed past them, one hand on the rail, rifle slung low. He stepped aside with professional courtesy, but his gaze flicked from Daniel to Evelyn and stayed an instant longer than politeness required. "Evening, Chief Mercer." The sergeant nodded to Evelyn. "Ma'am." She returned the nod. After he passed, Daniel said nothing. But Evelyn knew what he was thinking because she was thinking it too. That some people recognize competence the way hunters recognize tracks. Not from seeing the animal, from the shape of what it left behind. That night, the base never fully settled. Kestrel had its own sleep cycle, but it was a shallow one. A doze with boots on. Doors opened and closed past midnight. The hum of radios carried through thin walls. Once at 1:12, a helicopter came in low from the south and shook the barracks with RO of thunder. At 2:03, voices rose sharply outside, then cut off. At 3:40, Evelyn woke from a dream she could not remember with her heart already racing. The blanket twisted around her legs, and the certain feeling that something had changed while she slept. She lay still there. It was not a sound exactly. The lack of one. The base's usual mechanical layer had shifted. One generator down. One patrol vehicle idling longer than usual. The kind of absence only mattered if a person's mind had once been trained to hear systems the way musicians heard harmony. She sat up in the dark, breath clouding faintly in the room. Her civilian visitor tag swung from the bedpost, tapping a soft plastic rhythm against the metal frame. At breakfast, Daniel did not appear. A message reached her through Pike, who came into the mess. Hall smelling of cold wind and adrenaline masked badly as routine. Chief sent apologies, he said, not sitting. He got dragged in a morning brief and then route review. He said he'll catch you by lunch. Pike was trying very hard not to look young and failing at it. His gloves were shoved into his belt. His rifle sling had worn a raw spot into the fabric at his shoulder. Evelyn pushed the spare coffee across the table toward him. You look like you need this more than I do. He blinked. Ma'am, take it. He took it. Thanks. She studied him over the rim of her own cup. Something happened. His answer came too fast. Nothing unusual. You're a terrible liar, Corporal Pike. A corner of his mouth twitched despite himself. I've been told. Then I'll ask a narrower question. Was anyone hurt? No, ma'am. Was there contact? Pike hesitated. Motion sensors tripped along the dry wash west of the outer berm around 0300. Could have been animals. Could have been someone testing patterns. Team went out. Didn't find anything they could pin down, but he shifted his weight. But someone left a string of prayer beads tied to the wire at Sector 6, he said quietly. The sounds of breakfast dulled around her. Prayer beads. A message. Mockery. A marker that said, we were close enough to touch your walls. Who found them? Mercer's people. And Daniel. Daniel was on the response team. You said his first name. She noticed. Not Chief. Not Hart. Daniel. That meant fear had already thinned the formality between them. Pike looked as though he regretted telling her. He's fine, she nodded. I know. He frowned a little, as if unsure how she could know anything of the sort. Then, an order of bark from the doorway pulled him away. He downed half the coffee in one swallow, winced at the heat, and vanished back into the machinery of the base. The morning wore a brittle shine. Frost clung to the shaded edges of barriers. A maintenance crew worked on a surveillance camera mounted near Sector 6, while two armed sentries stood nearby with the uncomfortable stillness of people who did not like being observed while trying to appear unbothered. Evelyn was not supposed to be near the perimeter unsupervised, but rules in deployed places were often enforced according to available manpower and visible risk, and a woman in a wool coat with a visitor tag rarely registered as either. She stopped at a respectful distance and watched. One of the sandbags there had been torn open not by wear, she thought, but by a sharp-edged slice. Small, deliberate. The camera housing had mud splashed over its lens. Not accidental splash either. Thrown from below at an upward angle. She turned to leave and nearly collided with Nora. Mrs. Hart Lieutenant held a tablet against her chest. Her eyes were ringing with the darkness of interrupted sleep. This sector is restricted for visitors today. I gather that. Then you should probably gather yourself elsewhere. Evelyn might have resented the sharpness if she had not heard the strain beneath it. Instead, she nodded. You're worried. Velis gave a humorless exhale. I would be a poor intelligence officer if I weren't. What are you saying? The lieutenant studied her, clearly weighing rank, protocol, and the knowledge that this woman in front of her was not merely some anxious spouse asking for reassurance she could not give. Finally, Velis said, We've intercepted fragmented chatter. Nothing clean enough to act on decisively enough to know someone out. There is coordinating more professionally than the local networks usually manage. Insurgents. Maybe contracted fighters maybe a blended cell. There are references to a shepherd, a broken tower, and a wedding before dawn. Half of it could be coded, half could be poetry, and all of it could be baked. Why the Western Ridge? Velas's expression altered just slightly. That's a very specific question. It's the obvious question. For some people, maybe the cold between them changed character. Not hostile, alert, Velas lowered her voice. Because if somebody controls that ridge line long enough, even with light mortars and disciplined fire, they can blind our comms, pin internal movement, and split this base into pieces. Evelyn said nothing. And because Velas added, someone out there seems to know exactly how long it takes us to shift from morning routine to defensive posture. A beat passed. Someone studied you, Evelyn said. We think so, or someone taught them well. Velas looked at her more directly now. Chief Hart mentioned your father hunted long range. It was a test disguised as conversation. My father hunted deer, Evelyn said. And you? The answer sat like ice on her tongue. I don't hunt anymore. He did not smile. No, I suppose not. That afternoon, the weather turned. Clouds rolled over the mountains thick and low, swallowing the high points and flattening light across the valley until noon looked like late evening. Snow threatened, but did not yet fall. The wind shifted east, carrying with it a dry mineral smell from the high ground and the faint distant tang of smoke. Men on watch kept lifting optics to the ridges. The chaplain canceled an outdoor service. The delayed convoy was scrubbed entirely. Nobody announced a lockdown, but movement tightened inward. Less idle wandering, more helmets. At 13:20, Daniel finally found her near the comms yard. He was moving fast and looked like he had been living on caffeine and obligation. She handed him one of the cinnamon biscuits without greeting. He stared at it like a religious artifact. "Marry me again," he said. "I'll consider it." He took a bite, closed his eyes briefly, and leaned one shoulder against the wall. "I would commit minor crimes for another box of these. I brought 3. Now I know what hope feels like." She waited until he finished before saying, "Pike told me about the prayer beads." Daniel's posture changed. "Pike talks too much. Pike is scared." "Good. Fear keeps people from making theatrical mistakes." "And you? Are you scared?" He looked toward the western ridge. "I'm trying to be useful. That wasn't my question." "No," he said, "it never is." The wind snapped a loose tarp nearby. Somewhere inside the comms building, a printer spat pages in furious sequence. Evelyn spoke softly. "You asked me about the notebook." "I did. If I say no, will that make you stop?" "It might make me worry more." "Why?" He met her eyes. "Because this base was designed to withstand a direct assault by men with trucks, small arms, and imperfect coordination. It was not designed for an enemy that understands patience, overlapping fields of fire, and the psychology of panic." A silence opened. "Then how bad?" "We don't know yet. But if they come, they won't come loud first. They'll come smart." She stared at him. "And you're asking me about the notebook because you think I still remember how to read a battlefield." His voice dropped. "I think you never forgot." Something flashed across her face then. Not vanity, not pride. Anger perhaps, but braided with grief. The sort of anger that came for being seen precisely where one wished to remain blurred. "I burned my range cards," she said. "I know. I packed away every patch, every citation, every photograph. I know. I spent 6 years learning how not to wake up with my hands clenched." His expression did not move. "I know. Then stop asking me to go backward." "I'm not." His answer came almost as a whisper. "I'm asking what happens if backward comes here." He left then because he had to, because in war and in marriages built around war, the most devastating sentences were often the ones that could not be finished before duty interrupted them. The rest of the day passed in fragments. A cracked radio handset in the operations room. Mercer running a quick reaction drill twice with no explanation. Velas pinning updated imagery to a board already layered with acetate and marker grease. The medic station receiving extra plasma. A cook in a mess dropping a tray because the first distant thump from the west made her think, just for an instant, that the attack had already begun. It had not. Not yet. At 17:45, snow finally came. Not a storm, just a fine, dry sift that moved sideways in the wind and vanished on warm metal. Under the floodlights, it looked like ash. Evelyn stood under the overhang outside, billeting, and watched it fall. Daniel was supposed to meet her for dinner again. He did not. Instead, Chief Ramirez passed by with 3 radios clipped to his vest and muttered, "Tell your husband I'm stealing him for another hour if you see him before I do." Is something wrong? Ramirez slowed. He was the kind of man who disliked frightening civilians and respected them enough not to insult them with lies. "Something's about to test us," he said. "That's all I know. That's never all anyone knows." He gave her a tired glance. "No, ma'am, it isn't." He moved on. Darkness came early into the clouds. In 1910, the base shifted into that strange half-eye rhythm where activity increases even as light decreases. Flood lamps came on along the perimeter. Vehicles idled ready. Watch rotation shortened. Somewhere, someone began checking ammunition lots against issued loadouts. In her room, Evelyn sat on the cot with a leather notebook in her hands again. This time, she opened it. Inside were pages covered in clean, compact handwriting and pencil diagrams. Distances, wind notes, elevation holds, field observations. Old range sketches faded at the edges from use. The first half of the notebook belonged to another lifetime. Recorded shots, weather conditions, target patterns from terrain that was not this valley, but might as well have been because Stone taught the same lessons in any country if one listened long enough. A folded photograph slipped free and landed in her lap. She knew what it would be before she saw it. 3 figures at a qualification course years earlier, sunburnt and exhausted. Rifles slung. Smiling in the weary way people smiled when they had earned competence the hard way. One of them was Evelyn, younger and sharper, and trying very hard not to look proud. Beside her stood Staff Sergeant Lena Cross, whose laugh had once been capable of silencing a room and whose blood Evelyn still dreamed about in the wrong weather. On the other side stood a male instructor squinting into the sun, one hand lifted as if to block the camera, forever alive because photographs were indifferent. Evelyn put the picture face down on the blanket. She did not cry. That came later these days, rarely, and with warning. What came now was worse. The slow closing of some interior door behind which an older self had been waiting all along. Quiet, patient, never fully convinced the war was finished with her. Outside, boots ran past the barracks. Then the first mortar landed. It struck short of the motor pool with a flash so bright it cut through the seams of the window frame, followed half a heartbeat later by a crack that punched the air from the roof. The building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Somewhere down the corridor, someone shouted, "Incoming! Incoming! Incoming!" The second round hit nearer. Metal screamed. Glass burst. The alarm system came alive in one overlapping wave with human voices and sirens and a high, furious whine of shrapnel skipping off steel. Evelyn was already moving. Years collapsed, not vanished. Collapsed into function. She grabbed her coat, not because she needed warmth, but because pockets mattered, snatched the notebook, left the photograph, dropped low as she opened the door. The corridor beyond was chaos and underclow. Uniforms half-fastened, helmets clutched, people moving fast with the stunned incompletion of interrupted sleep schedules and emergency conditioning taking over. Another impact farther east. Suppression, she thought immediately, walking rounds across the bays to herd movement. A young medic nearly ran into her. "Ma'am, get to the bunker." "Which sectors are hit?" "What? Which sectors?" "I don't know. West side, maybe Fuel Point." "Just move." She moved, but not toward the nearest shelter. She moved with the flow until the flow split, then cut across it toward open ground between the building row and the operations building. The night was all hard white floodlight, black shadow and dust. Snow or ash or insulation fibers drifted through the beams. Men shouted coordinates. Somebody was dragging a wounded radio operator by the back of his plate carrier. Tracer fire lanced suddenly from the northern tower toward the western ridge. Not probing now. Not warning. Contact. The base answered with machine guns. Then came a sound that froze everything else in his significance. Deliberate rifle cracks from elevation. Not random volleys. Spaced measure marksmen. A guard on the south wall jerked backward off his stance and disappeared from sight. A second shot shattered the spotlight above Sector 6. Darkness punched a hole in the perimeter. Sniper. Someone screamed. Unnecessarily. Evelyn dove behind stacked water barriers as rounds snapped overhead. Plastic burst nearby with a wet explosive spray. Icy water sheetated across gravel and boots. The smell of cordite mingled with diesel and pulverized cement. Her pulse slowed. That more than anything terrified her because the body remembered this too well. A hand seized her arm. Daniel, helmet crooked, rifle up, face transformed by the kind of concentration that burned everything unnecessary away. "What are you doing out here? What are you doing?" Asking. He hauled her tighter behind cover as another round clipped concrete above them, showering grit into their hair. "Get underground now. That fire is coordinated from 2 elevations," she said. "Maybe 3. One's West Ridge, Upper Saddle. One lower shelf near the Dead Sea Dater line. There may be a 3rd shifting by muzzle discipline." Daniel stared at her for one stunned fraction of a second that was already too long. Then how sure? Sure enough to hate it. The mortar cadence changed. Slower, intentional, not saturation anymore. Channeling, herding defenders into predictable lanes while rifle teams pick them at transition points. Daniel keyed his radio. "Mercer, this is Hart. Be advised, enemy precision fire likely from Upper Saddle and Lower Cedar Shelf. West Ridge, possible 3rd mobile element. Confirm. Static." Then Mercer's voice harsh with movement. "We saw Upper Saddle flash. Lost eyes on Lower Shelf. Comms Tower 2 just took a hit. Say again." "Source." Daniel's gaze never left Evelyn. "Reliable." He broke cover in a crouch. "Stay here." But she caught his sleeve. "Daniel." He turned. "That is not harassment fire. They're building toward breach." For a second, the marriage returned inside the battle. Raw and visible. The knowledge of each other. The fear neither could afford. Then he was gone. The next minutes tore themselves into fragments. A burning truck tire spinning loose across gravel before striking a barrier and collapsing into rubber flame. Ramirez on one knee beside a field junction box, barking into 2 radios while sparks snapped from a severed cable overhead. Nora with no helmet, hair half free from its tie, carrying a map case and sidearm as she ran toward operations under incoming fire like someone late to an appointment she intended to keep. Pike firing control pairs from behind the wheel well of an armored vehicle, mouth moving around words nobody could hear. Evelyn forced herself toward the nearest hardened shelter because Daniel had told her to. Because survival sometimes meant obeying the obvious, because being alive was still the first duty if one wanted any choice afterward. Inside the bunker, 20 people packed too close in fluorescent light that flickered with each nearby impact. A civilian contractor held a bloody rag to his scalp. A cook prayed under her breath in Spanish. 2 signal specialists tried to re-establish contact with outer positions through handheld sets hissing with interference. The concrete room smelled of wet wool, fierce sweat, iodine, and dust. No one belonged inside their own skin anymore. Emergencies did that. They made the body feel rented. A little boy would have called it safety. Adults knew better. Safety was not a room. It was a chain of conditions. And several of those conditions had just failed. On the wall, a printed evacuation diagram fluttered as another blast shook the shelter. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the door, the vent, the thickness of the ceiling, the probable angle of fragmentation if the western side took a direct hit, the lack of alternate egress. She hated herself for doing it. Hated that calculation was easier than panic. Hated that part of her was counting human bodies the way one counted resources in containment scenarios. Across from her, the contractor with a head wound noticed her stare. "You military?" "Not anymore." He managed a nervous laugh and immediately regretted the movement. That sounded like a no, hiding inside a yes. Before she could answer, the lights went out. Darkness dropped hard and absolute. Someone swore. Someone else started breathing too fast. The radios crackled with overlapping voices and then died into static. Generator loss, she thought. Or comms cut, or both. Then through the concrete and chaos, a sound arrived that did not belong to indirect fire. Engines not inside the base. Outside, nearer than they should have been. The attack was evolving. She found herself on her feet before she realized she had stood. "Stay down," one of the signal specialists shouted. "How many exits from here?" "What? How many exits?" "Just a main and a maintenance hatch, but it's welded from outside for blast integrity." Of course it was. Another impact hit close enough to throw dust from the vent grill in a gray veil. The contractor whimpered. The cook crossed herself. Somewhere above them, automatic fire intensified, then shifted left, then intensified again. Breach pressure. Evelyn moved to the door and listened with one gloved hand against the cold metal. Footsteps outside. Friendly? Hard to tell. Shouts distorted by concrete. A burst from a machine gun. Another of those precise rifle cracks from a ridge. Farther now. Or maybe simply obscured by the dead acoustics of panic. Then Daniel's voice through the door. She wrenched it open. He came in fast with Mercer on his heels. Both men were strewn with dust. Mercer had blood on his sleeve that did not seem to be his. Daniel's eyes swept the room, counted civilians, assessed viability. "We're relocating non-combatants to the inner maintenance trench," he said. "Outer shelters are no longer safe." No one argued. The authority in his voice had left argument behind. Mercer took lead. Daniel took rear. They moved the group in staggered bursts between cover as the base around them convulsed under fire. Floodlights were failing in sectors now, leaving corridors of blinding light and sudden dark. Smoke from the motor pool drifted low, oily, and black. Somewhere fuel was burning hot enough to create a metallic taste in the air. Snow hissed to vapor where it touched heated wreckage. The inner trench was little more than a reinforced service channel running between the operations building, the aid station, and a storage annex. Narrow, cold, better than open ground. They packed civilians, and while medics dragged, 2 new casualties passed on litters improvised from doors and webbing. Evelyn caught a glimpse of one wounded sentry. Entry wound high in the chest, too clean for fragmentation. Sniper. Daniel saw her see it. "Don't," he said quietly. She looked at him. "You're losing the wall." Mercer answered instead. "Sector 6 and part of 7. They hit our tower lights, then walked mortar rounds across the response lane. Breach team tried the Western vehicle gate under cover of the barrage. Didn't make the gate, but they don't need to if they keep us pinned and blind." "How many?" "Enough." That meant they did not know. Nora slid into the trench moments later, breathing hard. Map case gone. Tablet cracked across the screen. "Intercept was right," she said. "Waiting before dawn. It means synchronized assault. Shepard is likely the field commander. Broken tower means comms degradation. They've studied our fallback patterns." Mercer swore once under his breath. Daniel asked, "Any external support?" "Nearest air is weather delayed and 40 minutes out if they launch now. QRF convoy can't move until the pass is cleared. We hold or we improvise." A long burst of gunfire rattled overhead. Then Pike dropped into the trench almost on top of them, face white beneath grime. Chief North firing lines down to one operational saw. "Dillon's hit. We got movement inside the outer wire by the maintenance sheds." "Confirmed. I saw 3, maybe 4. Fast using the smoke." Mercer was already moving with me. Daniel grabbed his arm. "You leave Sector 8 uncovered. They fold inward. And if I don't clear the sheds, they hit our rear vehicles and ammo." Nora cut in. "We're arguing over which artery to save." A fresh explosion ended the debate. The ground lurched. Somewhere behind them, glass cascaded. A wave of orange light climbed the trench wall and fell away. "Fuel point," Evelyn thought. "We're close." Pike flinched hard enough to reveal just how young he really was. And then the moment came, the one that had been approaching since the first prayer beads on the wire, maybe long before that. The moment when everyone in the trench realized that the plan they had trained for no longer matched the shape of the actual night. Daniel looked at Evelyn, not as husband to wife, not even as man to man, as one professional looking at another from across a boundary. Both of them had pretended still existed. "No," she said immediately. He had not yet asked. "Eve." "No." Mercer stared between them. Nora's eyes narrowed, suddenly understanding more than she had been told. Pike looked confused, then curious, then ashamed of being curious. Daniel lowered his voice. We have one long gun left with glass worth trusting. Sutherland is dead. Kim lost his dominant eye last month. The replacement rifle came in, but the shooter didn't. Evelyn felt something cold and an ancient move inside her ribs. Find someone else. There isn't someone else. There's always someone else. Not with this wind, this elevation, and this much light loss. Another sniper round cracked overhead and was answered by 3 wild bursts from defenders who did not know where to send their fear. Daniel's face was terrible because it held both urgency and love. They're pinning our medics. Eve, they're cutting movement between hard points. If they suppress the trench exits for another 10 minutes, this base stops being a defense and becomes a target box. She said nothing. He stepped closer. I'm not asking my wife to become a soldier again. No, I'm asking the best marksman I have ever known whether she will help me keep these people alive. The trench seemed to narrow around her. Smells intensified. Diesel, blood, dust, the bitter tang of explosives. Somewhere near enough to matter. Someone was crying and trying not to. Evelyn closed her eyes once. In the darkness behind them, memory did what memory always did under pressure. Not linear, not kind. Arrange on a hot afternoon. Lean across laughing because Evelyn had missed left by a quarter minute and looked personally offended by physics. A night scope payload with rain. The word breathe. The word wait. Daniel years ago on a Norfolk pier before marriage, before the quiet house, before all their careful domestic rituals, saying, you never have to explain the parts of you that kept you alive. She opened her eyes. To Mercer, she said, what rifle? His expression shifted from suspicion to respect with astonishing speed. M2010 in the South Tower fallback locker. Suppressed option available. Night optic compromised, but day glass intact. Limited 300 Win Mag. Some match grade, some standard. How many rounds? 39 total. Unless Quartermaster is lying as a hobby again. Do you have a kestrel meter? Mercer almost smiled despite the gunfire. You really are her. Daniel did not smile at all. Evelyn looked at him, and in that glance lay 20 things too large for words. Fear, resentment, trust, betrayal, love, exhaustion, history. If I do this, she said quietly, you do not ask me afterward whether I'm all right. His throat moved. Why? Because you'll already know the answer. For the first time that night, Daniel looked close to breaking, but only for a moment. Then training, duty, and the immediate mathematics of survival sealed the fracture. He nodded once. Mercer was already up the trench ladder. South Tower's compromised. Then not the tower, Evelyn said. It's silhouetted and already ranged. Mercer turned. Suggestions? She pictured the base in 3 dimensions from what she had seen on arrival from the tower walk from stray glances others had thought harmless. Wind channels, building heights, light spill, likely hostile angles. The chapel roof line is too obvious. Comms yard has too much antenna clutter. Operations second floor has glass and heat signatures. She pointed through concrete and darkness, as if the geometry were visible. The cold storage annex behind the aid station. Flat roof, low profile, partial sight line to the west saddle through the generator gap. Shielded access from a trench. Mercer stared at her a second, then looked to Daniel. I want her nowhere near a roof, Daniel said. You just told her there wasn't anyone else. I know what I told her. Nora Velas's voice entered like a blade. Then stop wasting the only honest option this trench has. Silence. Daniel's jaw hardened. Pike move. Get the rifle, range cards, kestrel, dope book, spare mags, and a suppressor. Mercer, clear the annex route. Nora, I need updated movement on the western shelves. Height climbed out at once, half terrified, half electrified. Daniel turned back to Evelyn. All the battle noise around them seemed to fold away for one private second. You do not leave cover unless Mercer says. You do not stay in position once they locate you. You fire only if you are certain, Daniel. And if this turns, if it goes wrong, it already has. He shut his eyes for an instant, then opened them. Come back to me anyway. Her answer was barely audible under the gunfire. Do your job, Chief. It was not what a wife said. It was what someone said when love had no time for softness. They moved. The route to the annex was a jagged sprint through 3 layers of cover and one stretch of ugly open gravel illuminated by a dying flood lamp. Mercer led. Daniel covered. Evelyn followed low, boots splashing through icy runoff and blood. She pretended not to notice. The world had contracted into sound and angle. Round snapped overhead like vicious fingers. Smoke pushed along the ground. A siren somewhere was stuck on a single shrill note that made the teeth fake. At the second barrier, they went prone as fire-stitch sparked from steel beam ahead. Upper saddle, Mercer muttered. He found this lane. Evelyn listened, waited, counted the rhythm between shots. Not impatience, adjustment. Shooter correcting on trace and panic fire for below. Not upper, she said. Lower cedar shelf. Slight, right of the broken outcrop. He shifted. Mercer looked a flash. Brief. There. Move on my mark, Evelyn said before she had fully decided to reclaim that tone. 3, 2. Now they crossed while the next shot went where they had been, not where they were going. Mercer made a sound that was almost a laugh once they hit the annex wall. I'm officially uncomfortable. Daniel climbed up last, breathing hard, and for one impossible second, he touched Evelyn's cheek with a gloved knuckle. A gesture so gentle it seemed to belong to another life. Then he withdrew, and the moment was over. Pike arrived 2 minutes later with a rifle in a drag bag and terror in his eyes. I got everything he said. I think there were 2 data books, and I grabbed both, and you did good. Mercer cut in. The words steadied him more than praise had a right to on the annex roof. The coal was clean and ruthless. Wind slid over the flat surface carrying smoke, snow grit, and the mineral smell of blasted stone. From there, the base spread below in broken geometry. Fighting positions, vehicle silhouettes, light pools, black gaps where systems had failed. Beyond the western wall, the ridge loomed, its features appearing and disappearing behind drifting smoke and inconsistent illumination from star shells and burning equipment. Evelyn knelt beside the rifle bag and unzipped it. The M2010 lay inside like an old language she had once spoken fluently and never expected to hear again. Folding stock, long barrel, chassis scratched from deployment wear. Glass not perfect, but serviceable. Bolts smooth from use. She ran her hand along it once. Not affectionately, not reverently, simply confirming reality through touch. Pike watched as she checked chamber, magazine, scope, turrets, bipod tension, bull travel, suppressor threads, sling snag points. Nothing boastful, nothing dramatic. Competence was often the quietest thing in the room. Mercer handed over the kestrel meter. She would have gloved finger, felt the crosswind against skin, then verified with the device. Not because she mistrusted instinct, because instinct without confirmation was vanity. Wind switching low to high, she murmured. Valley channeling gust on a half. Mirage is useless in this temperature. She peered through the scope, adjusting parallax. Range to upper saddle. Mercer had a laser rangefinder ready. 891 yards to the outcrop, 760 to lower cedar shelf. Add, or take depending on exact height. She inhaled once slow. Somewhere behind them, Daniel's voice crackled over radio traffic, directing sectors, plugging gaps, becoming the man who stood between disorder and collapse because someone had to. She listened to it the way sailors listen to lighthouses. Nora climbed onto the roof, crouching low with a marked acetate sheet and a red lens light cupped in her palm. Intercept update, she said. Possible second push from dry wash in 7 minutes or less. Shepard may be on site. They're referring to the Widow Tower and the Angel Window. We think those are their nicknames for our remaining firing positions. Or for ours, Evelyn said. Velis looked at her sharply. Meaning if they've studied you this closely, they've named your blind spots, too. No one answered. No one needed to. Evelyn settled behind the rifle, cheek to stock, shoulder weld, bipod planted on cold tar paper, dusted with grit, breath slowing. The scope drew the world inward until the ridge filled it. Stone, shadow, snow flecks crossing the lens, burned scrub, black creases in the slope where a man could disappear and still dominate a battlefield. She did not feel fearless. Fearlessness was for people who did not understand consequences. What she felt was narrower, harder, a chambering of the mind. Below, another burst of machine gun. Fire rose from Sector 8 and then faltered. Somebody shouted for a medic. Somebody else screamed, a warning drowned by explosion. Mercer spoke low. "Can you see them?" Evelyn did not answer at once. Her right, a hunted detail. Her left remained open, keeping some measure of the wider world. A habit from long ago, a survival of the self she had buried. Then she saw it. Not the man, the absence around him. A wedge of darkness and scrub where there should have been shaped continuity. A small angular repeat that did not belong to rock, and then almost delicately the faintest suggestion of movement as a barrel shifted a fraction to correct. There she whispered. Pike leaned in, saw nothing, and wisely said nothing. Evelyn took up slack. Did not fire. Wait. Wind eased. Wait. The flash came first. She pressed. The rifle bucked into her shoulder with a force both familiar and newly devastating. Suppressed, yes, but still thunder in the bones. Through recoil and recovery, she saw the shelf spit dust and shadow. A shape collapsed backward out of the hide. Mercer exhaled like he had been kicked. Impact, he said, then into the radio. Lower shelf, shooter down. Repeat, lower shelf, shooter down. The base below did not cheer. Battles did not pause for applause. But movement changed. Medics ran where they had been pinned. Two defenders shifted positions under cover of the temporary gap. A machine gun reacquired a lane had lost. Daniel's voice came over the net, clipped and controlled. Good shot. Evelyn's face gave nothing away. She ran the bolt high on the upper saddle. A new flash answered. Rock burst 6 in from her muzzle, spraying grit into her cheek. Contact, Pike shouted, though again, no one needed the word. Upper shooter had found them. Mercer dragged Pike flatter as a second round cracked over the roof. Evelyn had already relocated 20 and left, changing angle, fighting the instinct to rush. The upper saddle hide was better, deeper, more disciplined. Whoever was there had held fire through the first kill, tracked likely counter-sniper origin, and responded fast, professional, not luck, not bravado, professional. Her heartbeat slowed further, and somewhere down in the fire-riven maze of the base, as engines roared outside the wire, and a second assault wave gathered in darkness. Daniel Hart understood what his enemies had just understood too late. The woman on the annex roof was no desperate amateur clinging to a borrowed weapon. She was the reason some forms of silence felt lethal. This time the round passed so close to Evelyn's right ear that she felt it before she heard it. A displacement of air as intimate and violent as a whispered threat. Grit sprayed from the parapet edge. Mercer cursed under his breath and pressed himself flatter against the tar paper. Pike had gone completely still in the way of a young man who had stopped trusting his body to make good decisions. Evelyn did not move, not because she was unafraid, but because fear and movement were not the same transaction, and she had long ago learned to keep them in separate accounts. She counted. The shooter above was good. Good enough to range her position on first contact. Good enough to suppress counter-sniper response with follow-up fire before she could reset. That meant he was either working from a pre-established dope card, which required advanced preparation, or he was gifted with natural calibration, which required respect. Both options told her something important. He had been on that ridge for more than one night. She swept the scope right at where he had last fired, not where the last muzzle flash had originated, where a disciplined shooter would shift after a near miss. Rock shadow, the skeletal white arms of a dead cedar. A crease in the stone, just deep enough for a man lying flat. The crease was wrong. Too smooth at one edge. Snow settled into contour. And the one edge that did not conform to the natural lie of the surface was where a rifle stock created a micro-disruption in the wind shadow. A tiny asymmetry invisible to the naked eye, but readable through glass if one knew what one was looking for. She knew what she was looking for, but she did not fire. Not yet. Wind gusted across the valley. The crosswind reading on the kestrel meter shifted. She held. Below the McKestrel base continued to eat itself alive. A mortar round landed inside the fuel point perimeter, and the resulting fireball threw copper light across the underbellies of the clouds, illuminating the ridge for 3 full seconds as if God had pulled the curtain back. In those 3 seconds, she saw him completely prone, suppressed rifle beige winter smock with local mud for color discipline. Face behind glass. Professional equipment. The deliberate patience of someone who had done this before in another place and been good enough to come back. The light died. Evelyn made her adjustments from memory. Wind value half minute left. Range 1,100 yards to the crease. Elevation hold at 42 clicks above mechanical zero. Temperature depression on the bullet. Density altitude at this elevation. She ran the numbers with a mechanicality that startled her because it arrived so smoothly, like a language her mouth had never forgotten, even when her heart had tried. Nora Velas's voice arrived from the far side of the roof, barely above breath. Dry wash movement. They're staging 2 minutes, maybe less. Below them, the remaining machine gun on the north wall, suppressed toward the western gate. Somebody's radio went to pure static and stayed there. Mercer was on the net in low, rapid sentences, deploying his last reserve fire team to the breach point. 1 minute, Evelyn let the rifle become part of her skeleton, stuck in a hollow of shoulder, cheek in a stock, right eye through glass, left eye open, peripheral cataloging, not directing. She thought about Daniel once, a single compressed thought, not of his face or his hands or the particular shape of his voice when he laughed. Just the fact of him, that he existed at this moment in a place beneath her and around her, and that he was doing his job with everything he had while trusting her, perhaps for the last time, in a way she had once forbidden, with everything she was. The wind dropped, a space opened in the sound. She pressed the trigger. The M2010 fired. The suppressed crack was still substantial. A hard short bark swallowed almost immediately by the ambient ride of the base, but to the 3 people on that rooftop, it was enormous. The rifle tracked back through recoil, and she brought it forward again in one train motion, watching through the settling glass. The crease in the rock was empty. Not dramatically empty, not theatrically empty, simply and finally empty in the way a place becomes when something that was present is present no longer. Mercer saw it. He said, and there was nothing triumphant in the word, just confirmation. Evelyn ran the bolt. The empty case rang against the tar paper and spun once. Below, the acoustic signature of the battle changed. Not ended, not resolved, changed. Without the overwatch precision from the upper saddle, the incoming suppressive fire lost its discipline. Rifles from the ridge continued, but spaced further, less coordinated, the kind of fire that came from men who had lost their fixed reference point and were compensating with volume. Volume was survivable. Precision was not. On the net, Daniel's voice, 3 words, clipped and professional. Break their staging. He was talking to the machine gunners. Not to her, but the base began to breathe again in a way it had not breathed for the last 40 minutes. Movement opened between hard points. 2 medics sprinted across the vehicle lane with a litter between them. A fire team repositioned from the collapsing eastern sector to reinforce the breach point. A damaged but functional gun truck rolled into the gap at Sector 7, and its weapon immediately spoke to the western approach road. Mercer relayed, QRF launch confirmed. Weather window opened. Rotors are 40 minutes out. Air support on deck in possibly 55. 55 minutes, Evelyn thought. An immense span of time when measured in contact, a heartbeat when measured in distance. She remained behind the rifle, because neither of the 2 shooters she had engaged was necessarily the last. Because precision fire from elevation, if the enemy possessed more than 2 train marksmen, would resume as soon as they identified where it had come from, and they were professionals. They would identify it. She scanned left of the cedar line to the loose boulder field below the saddle. Wind spitting snow, loose stone thrown sideways by gusts, smoke drifting from below in long, oil-dark streams. The valley in front of the western approach was an ugly ground, all broken visibility and uncertain depth, exactly the terrain that punished rigid defensive doctrine and rewarded people who could read its contradictions. 400 yards below the boulder field, a figure moved, not fighting, not advancing, moving with deliberate purpose in a direction that made no tactical sense relative to the main assault. She held the scope on him, short steps, unhurried in the way that people were unhurried when they believed they were invisible. Winter coat, no visible weapon in his hands, small pack. He moved along the base of a rock wall heading east, away from the main assault vector, away from where every other enemy element was pointing, away from the fight, toward the communications relay tower on the eastern ridge. Something pulled behind her sternum. She considered no weapon visible, could be a local, could be a displaced civilian, could be nothing, could be the shepherd. Nora was at her shoulder before she realized she had said the thought aloud. The intelligence officer peered through her own compact optics in the direction Evelyn indicated. 10 seconds passed. 20. He has a radio handset in his left pocket. Velis said quietly. Too large. Wrong profile for personal use. Control unit or detonator. They looked at each other in the dark. I can't take that shot. Evelyn said the words tasted of copper. Not without confirmation. Spoke into her radio in clipped language too technical for brevity. On the other end, someone answered fast. She listened. Her face in the reflected firelight was a precise document of controlled alarm. EW intercept confirms active transmission from that direction. The voice matches pattern signature from the Shepard reference. He's calling in second wave adjustments and flagging our comms relay as a priority target. Target. The communications relay that connected Kestrel to the outside world. The relay that was coordinating the QRF launch. The relay that was telling the rotors 40 minutes out exactly where to come. If it died, the rotors would come blind or not at all. If it died, Kestrel became an island. Recall, said Evelyn, said nothing for 3 seconds. Somewhere below, Daniel was fighting someone else's version of this same impossible arithmetic. Defending a line with human beings who had names and families and the terrible vulnerability of being alive. Somewhere, Corporal Pike had stopped being young enough to feel invincible. Somewhere, Mercer was spending his last reserves of manpower against a night that kept spinning back harder. She thought about Lena Cross. Lena, who had laughed from a firing line in the sun. Lena, who had been so good at what they both did that she made it seem like. Lena, who had died not gloriously, not cleanly, but from a detonation device on a road that a better chain of decisions might have cleared, in a situation that a different choice in a different moment might have altered. The weight of past decisions was always heaviest in the moment. A new one demanded to be made. 1,100 yards, Evelyn said. Moving target, variable wind, compromised glass. Yes, Velis said. Moving rate, approximately 4 kilometers per hour. Angled right to left in my perspective. Partial rock masking on his east side. Yes, I will not have a second shot if I miss. I know. Evelyn breathed once all the way down. Let go. Let the rifle settle. Found him the glass. The walk was that of someone unhurried and certain. A man who believed himself beyond the range of anything the base possessed. A man who had perhaps arranged his assault around that certainty. A man who had studied the base, learned its rhythms, named its blind spots, sent prayer beads in the dark as a signature, as a provocation, as the assurance of something worse to come. The wind hit a pause between gusts, a gap narrow as a hell breath. She fired. The shot crossed 1,100 yards of cold mountain air in just over a second and a half. The figure stopped walking. He did not fall dramatically. He sat down against a rock wall, as if simply very tired. The handset remained in his pocket. The second wave never received its updated adjustments. The base radio net erupted with overlapping voices. Evelyn lay behind the rifle for a long moment without moving. The temperature of the rooftop pressed through her coat and in her knees, intimately cold, indifferent to purpose or grief. Snow had begun in earnest now, fine and dry, accumulating in the corners of the parapet in thin white lines, covering spent brass casings, settling on the barrels of everything. Mercer crouched at her side. That was him, he said, not as a question. She said nothing. Intercept just went silent. Nora confirmed. Her voice held the peculiar flatness of someone who processed catastrophe as data because the alternative was unbearable. No further coordination transmission below. The assault began to falter. Not immediately. The fighters who had already committed their positions continued firing with a mechanical momentum of men whose orders remained intact even when the person who issued them did not. The breach point at Sector 7 was briefly penetrated, but Daniel's repositioned fire team pushed it back within 3 minutes of vicious close-range exchange that Evelyn heard and understood from sound alone without being able to see it. The mortar fire from the mountains fell silent at 21:47. The rifle fire from the western ridge thinned gradually like a conversation losing its argument. By 22:15, the only sound from outside the wire were Kestrel's own guns. 53 minutes after that, 3 Chinooks came in from the south under a sky that had briefly broken open to show a cold scatter of stars and a valley filled with rotor thunder and rescue weight and a massive institutional authority of reinforcement. The battle for Kestrel Base was over. The other things were just beginning. Evelyn came down from the annex roof at 22:30, walking a stairwell lit by a single emergency lantern whose light threw her shadow enormous and shapeless against the concrete wall. She carried the rifle in her right hand by the barrel housing, suppressor cool now in the night air, the weight of it a fact she no longer had the energy to interpret. Mercer met her at the base of the stairs. He looked at her for a moment in that particular way, that people looked at someone when they did not know whether to be grateful, troubled, or both, and so settled for something quieter than either. "Thank you," he said. "Don't," she replied. He nodded. He understood what she meant. That gratitude here was a door to a room she was not ready to enter. He stepped aside. Velis seemed to understand that this was not coldness, that it was its own kind of discipline. "All right," the lieutenant said, and left the night, moved past 2 in the morning. In a temporary aid corridor, Pike had taken up a spot helping medics carry supplies. Not because he was trained for it, but because standing still was evidently beyond him at this hour. Ramirez had organized a perimeter watch consolidation with the reinforcement team and was running on whatever combination of caffeine and sheer temperamental stubbornness that had apparently sustained him through 2 decades of deployment. Mercer sat on an ammunition crate outside the operations building, smoking a cigarette he claimed not to own, staring at the western ridge with the specific expression of a man revising everything he thought he knew about what to look for. And Evelyn sat on the floor of the operations room with her back against the wall below the acetate-covered mapboard. And for the first time in 9 hours, she allowed herself to be still. Daniel sat beside her on the floor, which for a man of his physical authority and rank was an act of choice rather than exhaustion. He sat against the same wall, shoulder against shoulder, and they were both looking at the same middle distance where nothing in particular existed, and they did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "I dreamed about her last week." He had not asked who. She was laughing at something I said. I don't remember what. I never remember the words in a dream, just the sound. He was quiet. "I still miss her," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought if I stopped doing this, I'd stop losing people from it." And she thought about the soldier she had sat with in the corridor. The one hearing what he kept hearing, the one who had been told he was fine. "I think," she said slowly, "that the people you lose from it don't care whether you've retired." He turned to look at her, a question in his face that was also awaiting. "They stay," she said. "Either way, so the only real question is what you do with them." He absorbed this. She watched him absorb it, watched the familiar interior process behind his eyes where facts met feeling and negotiated a settlement she was not always privy to. "The notebook," he said at last. She nodded. "You opened it?" "Yes." He did not ask what she had seen inside it. He knew or suspected and understood that the asking was unnecessary and possibly unkind. What mattered was that she had opened it, that the door between present and past had not remained sealed, that there was now a conversation possible that had been stored too long under the false architecture of a finished identity. Outside the window of the operations room, the sky was beginning to do the thing it did at very high altitude in late winter, where the darkness at the horizon acquired a slightly different quality of black than the sky above it. The first whisper of gray that came before any color, the announcement of dawn written in the language of subtraction. Both of them saw it at the same moment and said nothing. Dawn, after a fight, was its own kind of sacred territory. She leaned her head sideways and rested it against his shoulder. He leaned his head against the top of hers. Neither of them slept, neither tried, just existed in the shared aftermath of a night that had asked too much and received it. There were things still to be processed. Formal interaction sequences, medical evaluations, intelligence exploitation of the recovered equipment and intercepts, administrative machinery that would grind into motion at full light and not stop for days. Evelyn's presence on that rooftop would need to be explained in language acceptable to official record, which was itself a project requiring more creativity than honesty. There were the conversations she and Daniel would need to have eventually. Real ones unsimplified about what had been broken between them and what had been restored. About the notebook and the photograph and the woman in the pink coat holding a fish. About whether a person could be two things at once without one of them destroying the other. But that was for later. Right now, there was only this. The base settling around them like a body catching its breath. The thin pre-dawn light at the window. The warmth of a shoulder against her cheek. The sound of boots on gravel outside, measured and purposeful. The base patching itself back together one procedural step at a time. And somewhere below the conscious mind in the place where identity was not chosen, but simply was something that had been clenched for 6 years began, very slowly, like ice in early spring, to move. At first light, Mercer climbed onto the annex roof alone. He stood where Evelyn had lain and looked out at the western ridge in the clean cold of early morning. The smoke had cleared. The ridge stood plain and unambiguous in gray dawn light. Its architecture of stone and scrub exactly as it always had been, indifferent to what had occurred beneath its gaze, keeping no record and offering no interpretation. He stayed there for a while. He had spent 11 years in security coordination across 4 different theaters. He had served with men and women who were exceptional, the kind who made you revise your understanding of human capacity in the specific direction of awe. He had seen courage that looked like screaming, and courage that looked like silence, and courage that looked like nothing at all until you understood what it had cost to appear so quiet. He picked up a spent brass casing from the tar paper, turned it in his fingers. Evelyn Hart had arrived on this base carrying a care package, a scarf smelling of winter, and a leather notebook no one was supposed to ask about. She had come as a wife. She had been seen correctly as something else by people who knew how to look. And when a night arrived that was designed by professionals to be survived by no one, she had settled behind a rifle on a freezing rooftop and demonstrated with extraordinary precision that some training did not expire. It simply waited. He set the brass casing back on the parapet. He did not know her full history. Classified, compartmented, or simply unspoken. Its details were not his to access. But he knew what the morning told him, which was that the base on which he stood was standing and that the people he was responsible for were alive to file their reports and eat their breakfast and write their letters home, and that those facts had an author. He descended from a roof and walked back through the recovering base toward the operations building. As he passed the aid station, Corporal Pike came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee with the expression of a man who had decided that useful simplicity was the only available philosophy. He held one out to Mercer without speaking. Mercer took it. They stood there for a moment in the early light. A generator started cleanly somewhere. A bird inexplicably began calling from the wire line to the east, sharp and declarative, as if it had urgent opinions about the beginning of this particular day. "Is she going to be all right?" Pike asked. Mercer considered the question seriously. "I don't know, but you think so?" "I think she's been all right before in situations where that seemed impossible." A pause. "I think she'll decide." Pike nodded slowly. They drank the coffee. It was better than usual, which might have been chemistry or relief or just the fact that after enough hours of fear, warm and bitter, became indistinguishable from comfort. In the operations building, Evelyn stood at the window, watching a ridge. Not with the scope narrowed concentration of a night, just looking, the way ordinary people looked at mountains. Snorts, the way anyone stood at a window and allowed themselves to be reminded that geography was older than conflict. That stone did not record grudges. That weather moved through and over and pasted everything human beings assigned to it without retaining a single particle of their significance. Daniel stood behind her. His hands rested on her shoulders, warm and still. "I'll have to give a statement," she said. Yes, they'll want a clean, authorized presence, authorized action. Legal and Velis will sort the language. You were assisting in base defense as the spouse of a senior operator who determined your capabilities were operationally necessary under emergency authority. There's precedent obscure but existent. She gave a brief sound that was not quite a laugh. You looked that up. I looked that up when before you opened the notebook. She turned to look at him that landed on her face and stayed there. The knowledge that he had prepared for this before asking, that he had thought through the aftermath before the necessity. That whatever she believed about manipulation or assumption, what it also meant was that he had cared enough about what would happen to her after to think in that direction before anything had happened at all. She did not know exactly how to feel about that. She thought she would probably know in a week or a year. These things settled at their own rate and on their own terms. And the wisest thing she had learned in almost 2 decades of marriage to a man who is often absent and always consequential was that the feeling did not need to be located immediately to be real. "Thank you," she said. It meant something layered by it. "Fami later, over dinner that doesn't taste like aluminum. That is your entire vision of peacetime. It's a good one." She turned back to the window. He did not remove his hands. The ridge and morning light was just rock. Outside, Kestrel Base was coming back to life in all its unglamorous, resilient, irreplaceable functionality. Vehicles that had been parked for emergency defense were returning to their operational routes. Engineers were beginning damage assessment at the motor pool and the communications tower. The two-man carpenter team had already looked at the blown-in mess hall windows and was debating what versus temporary plastic sheeting with the practical urgency of people who understood that morale lived partly in whether rain came through the windows during breakfast. Somewhere someone's radio was playing music again, a different station, something with a guitar, which meant someone had made a decision to allow ordinariness back in. Ordinariness was radical after a night like that. It required the conviction that there would be more mornings. In the billeting corridor, a different medic pinned a new note to the corkboard in Evelyn's temporary room. Not to her specifically, just to whoever slept there next. A reminder about the morning formation time and a note about the hot water situation in the eastern shower block. On the desk, the photograph of the little girl in the pink coat still held its corner with its single pin, triumphant and unnamed. The fish enormous in her small arms. The face lit with the uncomplicated joy of having accomplished something without fully understanding how rare and fragile such moments were. The photograph would stay there. Whoever came next would make of it what they would. 3 days later, the transport aircraft came back. Evelyn stood at the same gate where she had arrived, duffel at her feet, scarf around her neck. The wool still held the cold. The care package was mostly gone. The cinnamon biscuits were entirely gone, eaten by Daniel over 2 morning debriefs in a manner she considered undignified, and he considered survival. The leather notebook was in her bag again. She had not reared it. Daniel stood with her in the gray morning cold. He had 40 minutes before he needed to be somewhere else, and he was spending them the way he always spent time he did not have enough of completely. "Will you come back?" Back. He asked her mid-deployment. That wasn't the question. She looked at him. "Yes. Here. Not if I can help it." She said this with dry honesty. "But to you?" "Yes." He looked like he might say something large, then decided against it, and said something small instead, which was often more true. "Good." She picked up the duffel. He took it before she could. "Daniel, it has books in it. I can carry books." "Not this time." She let him carry it, because sometimes the letting was the thing. Because allowing someone to show up was its own act of courage. And she had spent a portion of the last 6 years mistaking self-sufficiency for safety, which was an error she could now see clearly and intended to slowly correct. They walked toward the departure pad. "The notebook," he said. "What about it? What are you going to do with it?" She considered. The wind pushed cold air across the tarmac. A ground crew signaled to the transport. Engines began their slow, warm cycle. "Keep it open," she said finally. He looked at her sideways, understanding what she meant and what she did not mean. Understanding that this was not a decision to return to operational life, not a revocation of everything she had built toward peace in the ordinary house in the ordinary street in Virginia Beach, understanding instead that it was a decision not to pretend that what she was had a finished edge, that the line between who she had been and who she was trying to be was not a wall, but a threshold, and thresholds could be stood in without committing to either side. "That's enough," he said. "I know," she said. The transport engines grew louder. He handed her the duffel at the ramp, held her hand for a moment in both of his, not dramatically, not with performance, just the warmth of it, the factual warmth of a hand that knew hers. 3 months, he said. 3 months, she agreed. She went up the ramp. She did not look back, because looking back was not the point. The point was the next thing and the thing after that, and the slow, ongoing work of living fully inside a life that did not require her to pretend that only part of it was real. The transport lifted into the cold highland sky below. Kestrel Base grew small and angular, a stitched-together fortress in a valley surrounded by stone. And then the clouds came between them, and it was gone. She held the duffel in her lap. Inside it, the notebook. Inside the notebook, the old handwriting, the range cards, the pencil sketches of terrain she would likely never see again. Inside the notebook, too, though she had not yet written it, the beginning of something else. Not orders, not calculations, not the architecture of lethality rendered in degrees and distances, just the record of what it meant to carry all of it. The skill and the loss and the love and the rifle and the photograph of the unnamed girl and the husband's voice over the radio and the cold of a rooftop in the mountains, and still be standing at the end of a night when the design had been for no one to stand. She closed her eyes in the dream she would have later at altitude in the freezing transport. Lena Cross was laughing, and this time Evelyn remembered the words. She had missed left by a quarter minute, and Lena had said through the laugh, "Still correcting you after all these years," which was the truest and most affectionate thing one shooter said to another. And Evelyn had laughed too, and the sun had been hot on the range, and both of them had been alive, and the rifle had smelled of powder, and the day had been ordinary, and therefore extraordinary, and it had been enough. It had always been enough. She did not need to resolve it. She only needed to carry it honestly, and keep going, and keep open, and show up for the next thing, whatever the next thing asked of her. The clouds outside the window were white and vast, and entirely indifferent, and completely beautiful. The transport flew on. Evelyn Hart, who had come carrying a wool scarf and a care package and a leather notebook no one was supposed to ask about, flew home. And somewhere behind her on a mountain in the highlands, the snow came down clean and white and equal over everything. And the western ridge gave nothing away, and the base held its breath in the particular stillness of a morning after violence that had survived itself. And the world went on in the way that worlds did, which was not by forgetting, but by continuing one cold and necessary breath at a time. If this story stayed with you, then you already know why stories like this matter. Real courage rarely announces itself. It arrives in wool coats and care packages and quiet notebooks, kept open against every instinct to close them. If you want more narratives like this one, stories that take ordinary people and place them inside extraordinary nights and refuse to look away from the cost, subscribe and turn on notifications. And tell me in the comments, what do you think is harder, the moment of action or the life lived after it? I'll see you in the next one. She came carrying a scarf. She left carrying everything she had always.